Well, you don't want to start too early because, don't want to irritate the people that show up on time by starting early. But the people that are early, we're rewarding them with the pre-show banter. Anyway, it says at 6 o'clock, so let's get started. Yes. Good evening. Welcome to another episode of Brent and Eddie's Sewing, 4 Pines Quilting, Friends of 4 Pines. Anyway, is there any news this week? Shop Pop continues. Come on in, buy some fabric, shop around. If you get all of New England done, I don't know what the number is, but when you look at a map, that's some work. If you do it, good on you. But certainly doable some of the regions. But the Shop Pop's on. It's been a lot of fun. People have been coming in, having a good time with it. So check that out. Lots of good deals here and at other shops. So that's really the only news we've got going. But the Shop Pop did inspire. You all watched the previous episodes of the construction of the quilt. But one of the things that we had talked about in the construction of the quilt, as we were using the Shop Pop fabric, is we had this very beautiful red leaf print that was also supposedly part of this collection with this red print here. See the two of these together? Does it really show on the camera how different they are?
I think so.
Because this one here has a little bit more orangey yellow to it. This one is definitely more of a red, probably more of a pink tone to it. You can kind of see on the camera when they're side by side that they don't really go together. And I thought this was interesting when we were doing this because I think to myself, well, they're supposed to be both from the same collection. Because if I read the top, they both say well, of course they don't have it because they're pre-printed, but they are from the Shop Pop collection. And so that made me think, let's talk about this. Do you know why they're off, Eddie?
Oh, you told me.
And why is it?
Because they're digitally printed.
They're digitally printed. Now, the reason that they were digitally printed, I can tell you this, is because it was probably a limited run because they designed it specifically for the Shop Pop. So they're able to turn it around a little bit quicker. They can control the numbers that they're running more. So they don't have to print off thousands and thousands and thousands of yards. They can do a small batch print because they did it digitally. That's one of the upsides to digital printing is that it allows you to run smaller batch sizes. There's other concerns about digital printing, but we're not going to get into that today. What I want to talk today about is matching. One of the downsides to digital printing is matching. Because if this had been done, screen printed the traditional way, they probably would have used the same dyes, the same red dye in here they would have used in here, so it would have matched a lot better. But because it's being digitally printed, it comes out exactly as it's designed. So one of the things that you have when you digitally print is you have access to all colors. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like all colors, like half shades and all shading. You're not limited by a certain amount of colors. It's like, I'm going to date myself, but if you go back, way back in time, back before computers were like computers, I mean, I guess they still were, but 256 colors. Like go back to MS Paint, like the early days when it had 8-bit colors, or 8-bit, or was it 2-bit? But there's like a 16 color palette, and then it got fancy with the 256 color palette, which 256 you can do a lot with, and you wouldn't really know that you're missing colors for the most part till you see like a 16-bit color palette, which is like pretty much all colors. And so that's the difference between screen printing and digital printing, is that printing has access to all the colors, where screen printing is going to use specific colors. And what would have happened when they printed this, had they screen printed it, the red that they used in this probably would have been the same dye that they used in this, so these would actually coordinate a lot better. But because it was digitally printed, there was nobody there to make sure that match happened. It was just like, this was designed this red, this was designed that red, that's how it printed out. Make sense?
Yeah. Why don't you just use like the paint bucket tool?
You could have used the paint bucket tool, I suppose. So to illustrate this point, I have a bunch of panels up here because panels are fun. I have a couple digitally printed panels, and I have a couple of regular screen printed panels. I'm going to start with, this is a regular printed panel, and what you're going to see on the bottom here, In fact, this is how I got tipped off to this, and this is why this started. Can you zoom into that right there? You see these cute little birds here? Those birds are the screens that were used to print this panel. So we have a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 birds. Or 12, oh, I forgot the white one, 13. So this panel has 13 screens, which means there's only 13 colors in it. And if you look, once you know that, you can look at it and see that there's only 13 colors. But that's what the salvage is going to tell you. And just as a side note, from when we chopped all the salvages off the trimmings that we did, there's some other information we'll go over on the salvage, because you can see that this is a Moda, Moda.com, the designer and stuff. So this is the Shop Hop, All New England Shop Hop 2023. Notice what this does not have. We can go from one to the next. We don't have that list of screens. There's no screens printed on here because it's a digital print. Are they both showing up in there? Or do I need to move it?
That one, it's turned up.
What's turned? This one's turned up?
Yeah.
Does that help in our professionalism?
Well, it's like, you can see it now.
You can see it now? Okay. Oh, I'm seeing it on there. Okay, yes. Oh, it's because of the angle you're at. I'm going to blame you.
Alright.
That's probably my fault. So, if you look on this, which is the Shop Hop fabric salvage, there's no screens. Look on this panel, we've got 13 screens. I don't know if you can really see it on there, but there's even a white screen on there. A lot of times they'll just use the color of the fabric, and I'm going to show you that here in a second. But so this has 13 screens. And this is a Moda. So what you could do is you could take this around. It doesn't necessarily need to be Moda, but if you take this around and just compare these colors to something on the shelf, you will match. These are the actual colors in the panel. So without ever seeing the panel, if I match up this blue here, I can then just, it's going to match this panel. If I match up one of these pinks, it's going to match this panel. Right? So far so good? No questions? All right. I'm going to take that off. And I had that on purpose because here's another one. This one was kind of interesting to me. You just unplugged it?
Yeah,
Okay. So, here is a Moda grunge. Everybody loves grunge, right?
I think so.
Kind of.
People like it.
People like it, yeah. So, can you see the salvage on here? What's interesting about grunge is when you look at it, you wouldn't know. This actually has 5 screens in it. So you've got the 5 screens, plus you have to take into account the actual red fabric on the background there. That's actually kind of considered a color because anything that doesn't have a screen has that color in it. So you've got these 5 screens plus the base red that it's printed on gives you your Moda grunge. Now, it's Moda. What's interesting is it's not going to be an exact match, but you're going to see how you can use salvages that aren't screen printed to kind of work. Now, you have to remember that one has a white background, one has a red background. But do you see how close that is to that? Can you see this? Does it look pretty good on the screen? Can you see that?
Close, yeah.
It looks pretty dang close, right?
Yeah.
So, I wouldn't have thought this till I started comparing salvages. But do you see how that might actually work with this? Because what's that? Do you see? So not only does this pink match, but you're going to find that that gray almost matches the other gray that was used in the screen for here. Now they're not the main colors for sure, but they're in there, so it accents it really nicely. And the other thing to keep in mind is, do you think Moda is keeping 1,000 different buckets of dye in their print shop? 1,000 different colors?
Maybe 1,000, but
Not millions.
yeah.
So you see what I'm saying is that all of their fabric is going to be printed from a fixed set of colors, which is why you will notice a lot of times across different fabric manufacturers, a lot of times you're going to see that they tend to blend really well. Moda's really good for this. Once you kind of get an eye for Moda, you're going to notice that a lot of Moda kind of looks the same because they're kind of printing out of that same palette because they're using the same dyes just over and over. I mean, I don't know how many they have, but let's say they had 1,000 dyes. think of how many different fabric lines you can make with 1,000 dyes. But because you have a finite set of dyes, you can actually match up something from 10 years ago to today because they're probably working out of that same toolkit as long as you know what to look for there. So you can go cross collections and everything and find matching stuff. Usually, like I said, it's easier to find matches within a manufacturer because of that idea that they're drawing from the same set of dye, fabric dye. But you can go across manufacturer as well because at the end of the day, I think most everything's coming out of one of 3 different factories anyway. But that's one of the things that you'll find with traditionally screen printed materials is that much easier to match. The problem now is look at this here. This is a beautiful panel. Right? Just look at the colors in that. You can't get those colors, but because you see the gradations in here, you would have, I'm just looking here, you would probably have half a dozen screens alone to get that coloration there, and then to come down here. So what you will notice a lot of times with fabric printing is you'll have a couple different, but you're not going to have really good gradations in 2 different shades. Like this looks really nice here in purple, but you've also got this down here in the orange is a real nice kind of gradation and tone. And you would be half a dozen screens for this, half a dozen screens for that gradation. You'll see some stuff that has like 20 screens on it. That's really expensive and really cool stuff, but this is done digitally. Downside to that is infinite colors. They're not working from a fixed set of dyes. So now with a digitally printed one, you don't really have a reference. You're just trying to find that same orange. But because that orange was manufactured by our robot overlords in the magic mixing of the digital printer, that orange might only exist here on this print. And it might not, in that exact combination, exist anywhere else. Because that's how digitally printing works. It's just mixes what it needs to create the color, and who knows if that color was used somewhere else. So it makes it much harder to match something. Like you can usually get a pretty good approximation, but it's not going to be with like screen printed goods where you can find stuff that was actually printed with the same dye, so you get a much or the same tint, so you get a nice match.
Jean says she went to 6 shops and we were the only one with Shop Hop fabric.
Really, I would have thought everybody had Shop Hop fabric. But that kind of is what I was saying. The reason that all that Shop Hop fabric was digitally printed was because it was a limited batch. Because for as much as we love New England, and New England is fascinating and all of that, to think that New England in and of itself could sell enough fabric to merit an entire run of that many bolts at regular screen printing, that would be a huge investment for Benartex to take, and there'd be a lot of it still left on the to run. That's why if you've ever noticed in the past, I know that like Vermont Shop Hop has gotten custom fabric made in the past, but they probably had a set number of yards that they had to sell ahead of time, and it was probably they probably didn't have a huge collection. It was probably just like 1 or 2 fabrics, and they just sold a lot of that, and it went with existing blenders. To do an entire line specifically for a Shop Hop, that's why they did it digitally, because they could to have the numbers for yardage that you'd need to sell. If you're doing traditional screen printing, it's a much higher minimum print. The woman in Portsmouth said her people, yeah, I don't doubt it, because I see they try to get me to buy lobster fabric all the time, and I'm like, nobody buys lobster fabric here. You got to go out to the seacoast to buy lobster fabric. Why would I have lobster fabric? Right? So far so good?
I think so.
And this is what's interesting about basics, because look at this one here. This one here has 5 screens. You would think looking at it, it's a very kind of plain kind of model look. But there are 5 different colors in this particular, in this print. And what you're going to notice is that 5 or 6 screens is probably where you're going to see a lot of your basics and a lot of prints, because that's kind of a good place to be. It gives you nice variety without having a lot of screens. Because what a screen means is they have to run the fabric through the screen cycle. So they've got yards and yards. They've got to run it through once, let it dry, run it through again for another color. So the more screens they add, it's a more complex pattern, And that's another reason why a lot of times when you're looking at fabric in a shop, basic lines, like for example a solid, which I didn't grab any because solids don't have screens, they're solid. But a lot of times too, like a basic line like grunge or which one is this? I was shadow play. You're going to notice that most basics are probably, yes, 6 screens is going to be a lot for a basic line. They're usually down to 3 or 4. And the reason for that is they're easier to make. That's why their basics tend to be less expensive because it didn't take as much to make it. And that's why a lot of times collections, like the fancy, like if you get a really colorful, like a Tula Pink, her stuff, they have to do a bunch of extra screens, so it's going to cost a little bit more. And that's a lot of times why you're going to see collections cost more than basics because there is more screens in producing them. As they get into digital, the digital process, the price will probably come down on that as it becomes more mainstream, but I'm still not sold on digital. Questions? People still good?
Yeah.
Nobody's like this is boring yet? Here's a and where's the salvage on this? It's always on the bottom salvage. So here's a great example. Look at how many screens are in this guy. And I always find it fun when they have fun with like the screen counts, like the birds on that one. This one's got little squids or octopuses. But there again, you see how many different screens were on this? 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. There's 16 screens. So this had to run through had to run through the press 16 times. So again, but that's how they get this really, like the first time I saw this, I thought it might have been a digitally printed because you've got a really kind of nice, because of all the screens, you get a lot more detail and a lot more going on. Now, if this had been digitally printed, you would probably see more shading in here because this shading here is really just a gradation of these two colors and it's the density of it between them. So they got that shading just by mixing it. So that's only 2 screens. It only took 2 screens to make that shading there. And you'll see that up here again with like the scissors. This is just changing the density of the 2 colors that make up the scissors. So that's how they're getting some nice shading effects without having a lot of extra screens. But that's why if this was done digitally, you would probably see a much more dynamic shading on the bottom of that airship because you could get away with it. You could add more colors to it. Does anybody care? Have I bored everybody to death talking about colors and shading today?
I don't know.
You don't know? Did you find it at all interesting?
That's pretty cool.
And digitally, I think is the direction they're going because of you can run limited batches. But there's a few things that we've noticed with it. One of which is the saturation. What you're gonna have, I don't even know if you can really show that on here. I don't know if it's really gonna show up, but I mean you can kind of see what I'm talking about when I talk about saturation. So this is the back of that panel.
And it's like goes through the entire pattern.
Yes, on a screen print, because you're running a single color, it's going to saturate the threads really nicely. So that's the back of the panel. Compare that to the back of this, which has been screen printed. Now you could say, well, it's thinner, lower quality fabric, so it soaks through better. And that may sometimes be the case. But what we have noticed on the long arm machine, this is where we first noticed this. We thought it was a dull needle, and a dull needle can sometimes give you the same effect. But we did notice a lot of times we're seeing this pop up with digital prints. And if you come and check out our shop hop quilt, I could probably actually show it to you I've got it hanging up so I can't show you now. But what happens is, I don't think you're getting enough saturation with digital prints because it's doing everything in one pass, so it doesn't have time to really let stuff sink in. And when you long arm stuff, what will happen is if the threads twist at all, because threads are round, the bottom half of the thread, I don't know if you might, if I tell you this, you're going to look at stuff and they're going to look at stuff that's been quilted and like, oh my gosh, it looks awful. But what happens is you'll get these little lines where you top stitch stuff. And what those lines are, now I've seen it happen like right here, you get a little line where it pulls, is my finger showing up there?
Yeah.
A dull needle will pull the thread a little bit when it goes through, so this white will pull into that black a little bit and creates this little kind of line there. Whereas with digital prints, what I think is happening is because you don't have good saturation in some cases, the thread itself isn't completely dyed, so when the needle goes through, it might twist that thread a little bit, and you're gonna get like a lighter look. And what you'll get is where you've got stitch lines, you're gonna see these miniature little lines around all of your needle holes, because the thread itself is turning a little bit as you're stitching, and because the digital process doesn't saturate the thread as much as the screen process does, you're going to see little striations. Now you'll see that as well on less expensive digitally screen printed goods, because again they're not using as much dye because they're trying to save some money, and by not saturating as much they're using less dye, and that we'll also see that where like especially in dark stuff, if it's like this here would be a good example because you can see it's printed on white. So what would happen is if it didn't dye through all the way, when you stitch here, the needle goes through and it just twists the threads around the hole a little bit, and you get these little lines. And that's one of the drawbacks of digital. It's really hard to see, but once you're aware of it, you see it and you're like, oh, and it doesn't come out in the wash because it's the thread that's twisted. You just have to hope that everything kind of fades to match. Oh, Jean's gonna have a baby. Well, not her. Somebody in her family's having a baby. And what I was just talking about with the threads, that little bit of a pull, and like what's really nice about like a grunge is because of the way that it's printed. Yeah, go ahead and switch over here. The way that this is printed, if you did get a little bit of that, you'd never notice it because it kind of matches this. But you really wouldn't get it with a grunge because you've got the dark. It's just really well printed. And if you do get it, and I have seen it on screen printed stuff, if you're machine quilting with a dull needle, it will cause it in some places on a very intricately printed pattern. Like say you had something like this here. I don't. Am I on the screen? I can't tell. Okay. What you'll run into is if you ran a dull needle and this had been screen printed, what happens is it pulls the threads a little bit, so all your threads get offset in some of these prints. And so if you ever look at a something that's been machine quilted, and you see where it looks like a thread's been offset, that was probably due to a dull needle, because the dull needle goes through and it pulls that thread a little bit. And you'll usually see this around the edge of a quilt or the edge of a block that hasn't been sewn really well, because there's nothing anchoring the edge of the thread and it just pulls it a little bit. And that's caused by a dull needle, but you'll have a very similar effect with I'm seeing a lot of digitally printed stuff, because the threads themselves aren't saturated enough, so the threads twist a little bit and create kind of the same effect. Anyway, that was boring. Or was it informative? I didn't even have good stories today. Is there a Mexican UFO thing going on?
I think I saw something.
Because I just like heard it in passing, and I'm like, did I miss something? Like, there's a UFO update?
I heard there's an alien.
That's what I heard. Okay. So I'm listening to something. They're like, yeah, we got to talk about the Mexican aliens. And so I'm like, and then the guy, and I thought they were talking about like illegal aliens, and the guy's like, no, the Mexican alien. So now I got to go look that up. See, we didn't even talk about any of the fun stuff today. I'm too busy talking about salvages of fabric. Oh, that was the other thing. I'm glad you made me stop and think about this. Here is the big mistake that I get all the time. Do you see this right here? Pattern number 30150.
Yeah.
That's showing up really nicely. Because I can't tell how many times people come into the shop and say, I need more of this color, and I know it's color 30150.
Isn't that the pattern?
That is the pattern number for grunge. That is not the color. All grunge is 30150. All of shadow play is, what is there? Do they have a number for shadow play? Oh, they might have a number. But all basics, like 30150, 2966 is Benertex Fossil Fern. But all basics, a lot of times we'll have a pattern number printed down here, but the pattern number is the pattern number. It is not the color number.
Yeah.
So that can be a problem, because like this is a great example. This is your Shop Hop fabric. What's nice is it says panel 14361. If they did this panel in another colorway, that 14361 would be the same for both of them. The number you typically will see on the bottom of a salvage is the pattern number. It has nothing to do with the color. All the color are the screens here. They don't actually print the color number itself down there, just the pattern number. And so what you'll find, yeah, like here's a good one. So Moda, I think they only did this one in one colorway, but a lot of times Moda will do everything in 3 different colorways. This panel might actually be another colorway. I'd have to double check. But this is 48350. That's the pattern for this panel. That is not the colors in the panel. So if they had another colorway of this panel, it would still show 48350. So that's something, if you're looking for fabric online and you have the salvage, that is something to keep in mind if it's a basic or if it's from a collection. Like I said, Moda usually does 3 of every pattern for a collection. So you're going to see, like, I don't know for sure because I can't remember on this one, but there's probably a couple other colors of this same panel, and it's going to have that same pattern number. So that's something to keep in mind as well when you're looking at salvage, or you say salvage because you want to find more of that fabric. All the salvage is going to tell you is the pattern number. And with basics, that's not helpful because that 30150 for grunge is one of about 200 different color possibilities. So that's something to keep in mind. Just because I've had people come in with salvage and say, here, I have this number, or I wrote this number down, or I took a picture of this number with my phone, and then you do a Google search for your number, and it comes up in a million different colors. Like I said, for basics, it's a thing. For a actual collection, a lot of times, you're only going to have to pick between 1 or 2 colors, and it's usually pretty obvious. The shading's not going to be as subtle as you're going to get on grunge, or shadow play, or fossil fern, or any number of other basics, because on a collection, it's usually pretty stark. You either have like a blue and an orange colorway, or a blue and a green colorway. You're not going to get a blue, a kind of light blue, a light blue, and a little bit lighter blue for a collection pattern, because they don't need that. They don't need something that's close together like they want with a basic collection, because it's not a building block. Anyway, I think that's all I have. Is that good?
Yeah, it was a good 30 minutes.
Did we kill 30 minutes? Did y'all learn something? Are y'all going to come back next week?
I'd say to keep your receipt if you want to know the name of the
Yes, that's a very good, because we do have actual pattern and color number printed on the receipt, because that just makes it easy for when people are like, oh, what color is this? And also, if you join our monthly Basics Builder Club, we give you a little card that has style and color number on it. Anyway, I think that's all I've got. Do you have anything else you want to add?
I think I'm all set.
You're all set? Now I gotta go home and look at Mexican aliens. But I think it's gonna be hard to research, because that's just a very... Anyway. Thanks for watching. So on, and be excellent to each other.